Hello, it's Scott Manley here. It's 2024. It's time for the mother of all deep space updates. Yeah, it's been a few weeks since the last one, what with the holiday season, and it's exactly the season when all the launch providers were apparently rushing to get in some launches before the end of the year. So, we're going to rewind back to December 14th and go through the 20 odd launches that have happened in the intermediate time. So we start with a Long March 2FT, right? That is China's launch vehicle for their reusable experimental spaceplane, which is still secret. It was launched. There are no photos of it. There's no video of it. There's not even the leak of what the fairing looks like. But it looks like it's in a 50-degree orbit, 330 kilometers up. The previous mission was about 7 or 9 months or thereabouts. So we'll see how long this mission is. China obviously has its reusable spaceplane, very similar to the American X-37B, which coincidentally also launched in the last few weeks. But we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, now we get to the footage. Yes, 15th of December, Electron returns to flight with the Moon God Awakens, carrying a satellite called QPS SAR-5 from Mahia into sun-synchronous orbit. This is a Japanese synthetic aperture radar satellite. Yeah, previously, if you remember back in September, We Will Never Desert You. Unfortunately, the second stage decided to not work correctly. So this is a return to flight for Electron. 15th of December, a Long March 5 carrying a Yaogan 41 satellite into geostationary Earth orbit. This is a reconnaissance satellite, which of course has many peaceful applications, but we all know that it can do all sorts of interesting military stuff from a vantage point that lets it see 1/3 of the Earth's surface. Notable that this launched with an 18.5 meter fairing, when normally the fairings are like 12.3 meters. So this is a much larger fairing. 16th of December, a Soyuz 2.1B carrying Arctica M from Baikonur into a Molniya orbit. And this is a very interesting hydrometeorological satellite. It's capable of observing the northern hemisphere. So it's going to do weather and climate science from the northern hemisphere, providing like continuous high angle views of the North Pole and, well, of course, US and Russia. 17th of December, Hyperbola 1. Yeah, we haven't heard much about that, but this is the 6th launch of this small Chinese launch vehicle. The 3rd success of it. It was carrying a spacecraft called Deer into sun-synchronous orbit. And Deer is a prototype, recoverable, reusable cargo spacecraft. And we believe it is carrying life sciences and other stuff, and it will be recovered at some point in the future. 19th of December, Falcon 9 carrying Starlink, 23 of them from Cape Canaveral and from Slick 40. 21st of December, Soyuz 2.1B carrying the BARS M5L Cosmos satellite. This is a military reconnaissance satellite launched into sun-synchronous orbit from Plesetsk. 22nd of December, Firefly Alpha make their 4th flight from Vandenberg with Fly the Lightning, carrying a satellite known as Tantrum, built by Lockheed Martin. And it was supposed to demonstrate its wideband electronically steerable antenna. However, they got a lump of coal in their stocking when apparently the second stage engine didn't relight correctly in orbit, and it's been left in an orbit which is too low, and it looks like currently atmospheric drag is winning the battle, and the satellite will be getting deorbited relatively soon. 23rd of December came another Starlink launch from Falcon 9, specifically Falcon 9, the NASA booster number 1058. And if you watch my video, you'll know that landed successfully, making it 19 launches and landings. However, on the way back, the sea conditions were not conducive to a safe return. The booster fell over, and that was the end for this historic launch vehicle, which, as I said, it launched more times than all of America's different, crew capsule space programs. It's a hugely significant capability that they've demonstrated. Okay, 24th of December, we also had a Falcon 9 launching from Vandenberg. And this was interesting. It was carrying a pair of synthetic aperture radar satellites, SARA 2 and 3, and it launched at 5:12 a.m., about an hour and a half before dawn. And we did see the second stage getting illuminated by the sunlight, which was very cool. But I anticipated that the exhaust would also form noctilucent clouds, and I was really excited that I got this video of noctilucent clouds forming on Christmas Eve. Christmas Day, 25th of December, Kuaizhou 1A from, of course, X-Space, launching Tianmu 11 through 14. This launched into sun-synchronous orbit, and there's some amazing drone footage showing the launch vehicle from above as a near-suicidal drone gets almost in the line of fire. I think Tianmu is supposed to be a set of meteorological satellites that do atmospheric analysis based on GNSS. That is what I've heard, but yeah. Also on the 25th of December, a Long March 11H carrying a Xi'an 24C, which is an experimental satellite. This was launched from a barge in the East China Sea into sun-synchronous orbit. Yeah, so experimental satellite, probably tech demonstrator of some kind. 26th of September, China is continuing to lay on the launches towards the end of the year. A Long March 3B/E carrying the Beidou 3 satellites, numbers M25 and M26. These are medium Earth orbit communications and guidance navigation satellites. Very similar to GPS, but with more communications capability. Also on this, one of the boosters was filmed from the ground. Why was it filmed from the ground? Because it was near somebody that lived on the ground, that had a house. This, of course, doesn't look great, but hey, it's China. What are they going to do? 27th of December, Kuaizhou 1A again launching, carrying more Tianmu satellites, 19 through 22 into sun-synchronous orbits. More of the same, atmospheric analysis apparently. 27th of December, we saw a Soyuz 2.1V, which is of course not a Soyuz because it doesn't have 4 boosters. It's a single core that isn't really derived from Soyuz in any way, but it does contain the same engines which were used on the N1 rocket. This satellite was called Cosmos 2574. It's also known as Rasberg number 1. It's a reconnaissance satellite used into a sun-synchronous orbit. 29th of December, yes, the final big Falcon Heavy launch of the year, USSF 52. And boy, yeah, we don't really know what's going on with this X-37B, but what we did see was that the re-entry location implied that after the vehicle went out of range, it was going to make a dogleg maneuver, boost up into a highly eccentric orbit, probably up to geostationary orbit, but it's more transfer orbit, and then the booster was going to come down several hours later. So yeah, that's an interesting orbit, and we'll talk a little more about it. What we did get was some absolutely stunning photos, including this one by John Krause, of Falcon Heavy against the moon, lined up perfectly. You can actually see the moonlight slipping between the boosters. It looked absolutely stunning. And yeah, that was top notch. So yeah, I think X-37B, as we know, it carries US Air Force payloads. It does science in space. It's basically the US Air Force doesn't want to do science on the International Space Station because there are other countries there. So they put their experiments on the X-37B and it goes off and does its own thing. This is the first time that they've gone to this highly eccentric orbit, and when this comes back, it will be the first spacecraft to attempt a re-entry using a non-ablative heat shield, slow itself down and land somehow. Now, interestingly, it has its perigee in the northern hemisphere, and when you think about that for a second, that makes absolute sense because if it's going to go up into this high orbit, it has to come down and re-enter. It wants to be in the northern hemisphere where its various runways are. But because of the laws of physics, this orbit is going to precess around the world, and the location of the perigee is going to slowly slip towards the south. So this actually places a constraint on how long they can stay in orbit. I don't think this mission will be as long as the other ones. But yeah, it's probably doing some interesting testing that requires going through the Van Allen belts. And I think because of the way the orbit's going to precess, it's going to see different chunks of the Van Allen belts over the coming months. But anyway, what was interesting about this as well was they launched it, and less than 3 hours later, 2 hours and 54 minutes, there was another launch from Florida, another Falcon 9 carrying 23 Starlink satellites from Slick 40. And this is a new record for consecutive launches in recent years, because of course Back in the Gemini program, they would launch the Atlas Agena, and then the Gemini would launch after it about 90 minutes later. But yeah, this is wild that they've now got their, they can get their cadence down to hours apart. 30th of December, a Long March 2C carrying a spacecraft called Huliawang Yishuxian. 4 A, B, and C. These are believed to be LEO ComSats. But 1st of January, the first of the new, that was the last launch of the year. So China really came in strong towards the end of the year with a lot of launches. But 1st of January, India begins the new year with the launch of their PSLV, carrying a spacecraft called XPO satellite, the X-ray polarimetry satellite, into sun-synchronous orbits. This is a space telescope. It carries 2 instruments, a polarimeter and an X-ray spectrometer and timing experiment. And that will be used to, of course, look at high-energy sources in the sky, things like black holes. 3rd of January, from Vandenberg Space Force Base, we saw Starlink, 21 satellites, and notably, 6 of these Starlink satellites are going to be part of the new direct-to-cell phone service capability that they're hoping to grow out into a full-on service, partly initially provided by T-Mobile. Also, 3rd of January, not long later, there was a Falcon 9 carrying Osvon 3 geostationary satellite for Sweden. It delivers satellite service from broadband internet to Europe from this geostationary orbit. So that was, wow, that's a lot of launches. But also, I have to add, on the 19th of December, there was a new Shepard launch, NS-24, the return to flight after the previous failure in September of 2022. This was carrying experiments, only 33 of them. I don't know what experiments were on there. I haven't seen the list, but I did see in the sort of the previews that there was a fuel cell experiment that was going to be on board, presumably demonstrating that it could operate in 0G. It reached a 106 kilometer apogee and has touched down successfully. So yes, 2023, let's just quickly go through the numbers. The USA launched 108 times, and that bet a Soviet-era record. In 1982, Soviet Union launched, I can't remember how many, but it was less than 108. Over the whole year, over all countries, 223 orbital rocket launches. 12 of them were failures, however. So that's impressive. 28 of those launches were in December. As I said, people were rushing to hit the end of the year. 98 of the launches from the US were SpaceX. And I'm going to point out that while SpaceX had been aiming for 100 launches, and they didn't quite get it, 5 of those launches were Falcon 9s, and that meant there's another 10 boosters to add to that. So 108 launch boosters were launched by SpaceX. Also, SpaceX completely led the world in terms of total upmass. 1,200 tons of satellites were launched into orbit. And this year, they're setting a goal of 12 launches per month. So that'll be a target of 144 launches for those people that can't do basic math. Anyway, let's talk about some other quick highlights. There's lots of new rockets, some interesting satellites, and other stuff. So January, ABL Space Systems, they debuted their RS-1 unsuccessfully. India debuted the SSLV in February. In March, Relativity debuted the Terran 1. April, Tianlong 1 was launched for the first time by Space Pioneer, and they became the first startup, the first company to build a liquid-fueled rocket and get it to orbit on their first attempt. However, April was somewhat overshadowed by Starship's initial flight test and its massive rock tornado. Also, Hakuto R crashed into the moon in April. In May, North Korea launched the Chollima rocket for the first time. It was initially unsuccessful, but they would eventually get this to orbit. In June, Rocket Lab launched the HASTE program, Electron carrying hypersonic test payloads from Wallops. July, Chuche-2, Chinese rocket fueled by methane and liquid oxygen, became the first Methalox rocket to reach orbit. August, Luna 25, Russia's return to interplanetary exploration, crashed into the moon. But a couple of days later, India successfully landed on the moon with Chandrayaan-3, or rather Vikram, which is the name of the lander. And it reported, did science for a couple of weeks before the sun set. September, OSIRIS-REx returned its sample canister to the Earth, and the spacecraft became OSIRIS-APEX for its future mission going forward. October, the Psyche mission launched on a Falcon Heavy, a year later than usual, but no less impressive. In November, we also had Lucy flying by Dinkinesh, the first target on its mission to many, many asteroids, and it discovered that Dinkinesh had a satellite. In fact, the satellite was later revealed to be a contact binary, so they found 2 extra objects there. Very impressive. But yes, November, again, kind of overshadowed by the fact there was Starship IFT-2, which was vastly more successful, very spectacular, and almost made it to orbit, except for a problem with the second stage. Came up a bit short, but nevertheless, it was an impressive attempt. And December, Korea debuted another new launch vehicle, all-solid launch from a platform in the ocean. Wow. So now, the last few weeks, what other bits of news are worth reporting? Well, Ingenuity, as you know, is continuing to operate on Mars, and it made a historic flight number 69. Nice. So 705-meter long flight, which, it's not an interesting number, but I did figure out that if you measure 705 meters in the units of a standard Jack Black, who is 5'6", then that is 420 Jack Blacks. Psyche, they demonstrated their laser communication system, sending a cat video back from deep space. This cat was named Tater, as it showed Taters chasing after a laser pointer, appropriately enough. This was from 31 million kilometers away, about 80 times the distance from the Earth to the Moon. The video had been uploaded to the satellite prior to launch. The link, because it's more capable of sending data back than it is sending data to the satellite. But apparently the link has been operated at speeds of up to 267 megabits per second, which is pretty impressive. In fact, it would send back the entire payload from some, missions in a few hours, if not minutes. If you think about it, Galileo was sending data back at maybe 8 bits per second sometimes, so it wasn't hard to beat that. Europe are continuing to have problems with their launches. Their only operational launch vehicle, Vega, it had one more launch on the calendar, except that they couldn't go because they couldn't find some tanks for its upper stage. And they were eventually located in a landfill, crushed and totally unusable. So they're having to, I think what may happen is they will take tanks and hardware that was designed for testing and condition them for flight. Also, the Ariane 6 had problems with the second stage ground test. It was cut short. But at this point, Arianespace are saying that this doesn't affect their overall timeline, and they still expect to launch it in the middle of 2024. NASA Marshall Space Flight Center showed off a 3D printed rotating detonation rocket engine, which ran for 251 seconds. That's a bit more than 4 minutes. It's generating 5,800 pounds of thrust, or about 2.6 tons. Now, rotating detonation engines, they're a hot thing to talk about, and you might have expected me to put together an explainer video, but I didn't need to, because I actually did that several years ago and everybody has been linking to it. So if you're interested in the science behind rotating detonation engines, that is a great primer for you. Also, interestingly, GE, known for making aircraft engines, they put out a press release saying that they have developed a turbine-based combined cycle engine, which not only includes like a turbofan and a turbojet. We have a rotating detonation engine cycle in the ramjet phase. So that's interesting. I don't know if that'll be propelling some sort of new future, military jet of some sort, but that'll be an interesting one to watch. We're also seeing, we had the launch of Starship back in November, and we did say that it was expected that we would see testing before the end of the year, and indeed, we saw testing as early as the 20th, I believe. We started off with like a 6-engine test of the Starship, switching between phases. We've seen the booster engine tests. We've seen also Starship testing the little space Pez dispenser, which it could use to, toss Starlink satellites out in orbit. And there's some speculation that the test that it did was consistent with a launch into orbit, deploying satellites, and then deorbiting. And we may see that in a test flight sooner than we expected. But also relevant for this month is that the Japanese spacecraft SLIM is now in lunar orbit, and it is returning images of the lunar surface. It's getting ready to land. It'll probably make the landing attempt on January 19th. The lander will aim to set down in a small 100-meter radius target area on the slope of the crater called Scioli, so watch for that in a couple of weeks. But really, the thing to watch for in the next week or so is Vulcan. Vulcan was going to launch on Christmas Eve. It didn't because they missed some issues, and now the next window is on the 8th, I believe. It's going to be carrying the Peregrine lunar lander, and assuming this works, on that date, it should be expected to touch down on the moon on February 23rd. But it's also worth noting that you should watch ULA around this time, because it's known that it is up for sale or is trying to find a buyer for it. And the word is that there are 3 potential buyers that are in the running to acquire ULA. And given that launching Vulcan is probably going to be a big deal, that's when we might actually see some announcements. But the 3 potential buyers that have come up are Blue Origin, which obviously has a great deal of synergy since they provide the engines for the first stage of Vulcan, and they're really interested in getting into the whole national security launch contracts. There's Cerberus, which is, a sort of, it's mostly an investment company, and they were the ones that put money to rescue Stratolaunch and turn it into the hypersonic test platform that is currently operating as. And the third one is called Textron, and some of you may have heard of it. More of you may have heard of one of the things that Textron Aviation build, the Cessna. Yes, so the Cessna light aircraft that many people learn to fly in could potentially be built by the same company that builds rockets that go to space. To be fair, Cessna also build private jets in the form of the Cessna Citation, but when you're hearing people over the radio, they never call themselves a Cessna. They'll say that they're a Citation because no one wants to have their multi-million-dollar private jet sold confused with a, little Cessna prop. So, okay, that is a whole lot to talk about. This has been quite an update, and I'm hoping to get back on a tighter schedule now that the holiday season is over. I am also expected to be at the Astro Awards in a couple of weeks. Specifically, I'm going to be DJing at the pre-party along with Everyday Astronaut. They'll be performing, and that is going to be an interesting weekend. Maybe see you there. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.